Chapter 1. The seeds are planted. Ancient times to 800 BCE. The beginning of human dreams. Picture the very first humans huddled around flickering fires in dark caves thousands of years ago. Outside their small circles of warmth and light, dangerous animals prowled in the darkness. Harsh weather threatened their survival, and finding food was a daily struggle that often ended in hunger. Yet even in these desperate moments, something remarkable happened. These early people began telling each other stories about better places, magical lands where food was always plentiful, where no wild beasts could harm them, and where the sun always shone warmly. We know this because archaeologists have discovered cave paintings from over 30,000 years ago, showing not just the harsh reality of hunting and survival, but also mysterious scenes of abundance, peaceful gatherings, and symbolic representations of paradise-like conditions. These ancient artistic expressions reveal that from humanity's very beginning, we possessed an extraordinary ability to imagine worlds better than the one we lived in. The earliest evidence of organized utopian thinking emerges from the world's first civilizations in Mesopotamia, the fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now Iraq. Around 3,000 years before the birth of Christ, the Sumerians, who invented the world's first writing system, began recording their dreams of perfect places on clay tablets. The most famous of these early utopian visions was called Dilmun, described in Sumerian literature as a divine paradise located somewhere beyond the eastern mountains or across the sea. According to these ancient texts, Dilmun was a land where fresh water flowed constantly from underground springs, where date palms grew without human cultivation, where wild animals lived peacefully alongside humans, and most remarkably, where death and disease simply did not exist. The Sumerian creation myths tell us that before humans were expelled from this paradise, they lived in Dilmun alongside the gods themselves, never knowing pain, aging, or want. What makes these Sumerian tablets so fascinating is how detailed they are about the practical aspects of this perfect world. Unlike later religious texts that describe paradise in vague spiritual terms, the Sumerians were quite specific about what made Dilmun perfect. They wrote about abundant fish in the rivers, fruit trees that never stopped producing, grain that grew without planting or watering, and animals that gave milk and meat freely without needing to be hunted or herded. This practical focus reveals something important about early utopian thinking. These people were not dreaming of escape from physical reality, but rather of a perfected version of the physical world they knew, where all the hardships of agricultural life simply disappeared. Moving westward along the Mediterranean coast, the ancient Egyptians developed their own elaborate vision of paradise called the Field of Reeds, which appears in their religious texts around 2,500 years before Christ. Unlike the Sumerian Dilmun, which was a place on earth that humans had lost access to, the Egyptian Field of Reeds was primarily conceived as an afterlife destination, though some texts suggest it could also be reached by living people under special circumstances. Egyptian tomb paintings and papyrus scrolls describe this paradise in extraordinary detail, showing endless fields of grain that reached above human height, rivers flowing with clean water and teeming with fish, and gardens where every type of fruit and vegetable grew in perfect abundance. The dead who reached this paradise were shown wearing fine linen clothing adorned with gold jewellery, and spending their time in leisure activities like hunting waterfowl in marshes or sailing boats along peaceful canals. What sets the Egyptian vision apart from earlier Mesopotamian ideas is its emphasis on social perfection alongside material abundance. In the field of reeds, there were no social classes, no masters and servants, no rich and poor. Everyone lived in beautiful houses, wore fine clothes, and had access to all the food and drink they desired. The Egyptian texts specifically mention that in this paradise there was no hunger, no thirst, no pain, no sorrow, and no fear. Even more interesting is that the Egyptians believed this perfect world operated according to the principle of Ma'at, which represented truth, justice, harmony, and cosmic order. This suggests they understood that material abundance alone was not enough to create paradise. There also needed to be perfect moral and social conditions. As we travel further east to the Indian subcontinent, we encounter perhaps the most sophisticated early utopian vision in the Hindu Vedas, composed around 1500 years before Christ. These ancient Sanskrit texts describe a golden age called Satya Yuga, the first and most perfect of four world ages in Hindu cosmology. According to Vedic literature, during Satya Yuga, all human beings were naturally virtuous, truthful, and content. There was no need for government, laws, or punishment because everyone instinctively did what was right. People lived for thousands of years, enjoyed perfect health throughout their extended lives, and possessed physical bodies that were tall, strong, and beautiful. The earth itself was said to produce food without cultivation. Rivers flowed with milk and honey instead of just water, and trees bore fruit constantly throughout all seasons. The Vedic description of Satya Yuga is remarkable for its psychological sophistication. Unlike earlier utopian visions that focused mainly on eliminating physical hardships, the Hindu texts emphasize the mental and spiritual perfection of humans during this golden age. People in Satya Yuga were said to be free from anger, jealousy, fear, and all other negative emotions. They lived in harmony not only with each other, but with all animals and plants, understanding their interconnectedness with all life. Knowledge came naturally to everyone, without the need for teachers or books, and every person could communicate directly with divine beings. This vision suggests that the ancient Indians understood that true paradise required not just perfect external conditions, but also the perfection of human nature itself. The most famous and influential ancient utopian story comes from Mesopotamia in the form of the Epic of Gilgamesh, written around 2100 years before Christ, making it one of the world's oldest surviving works of literature. This epic poem tells the story of Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, who goes on a quest to find immortality after his best friend Enkidu dies. During his journey, Gilgamesh meets Utnapishtim, the survivor of a great flood, who lives in a perfect garden at the edge of the world. Utnapishtim's garden represents the ultimate utopian space, where time seems to stand still, where divine beings walk among mortals, and where the normal rules of life and death do not apply. What makes Utnapishtim's garden so significant in the history of utopian thought is how it addresses the fundamental human fear of death and impermanence. The garden is described as a place where jeweled trees bear precious stones instead of fruit, where the grass is made of lapis lazuli, and where everything is eternal and unchanging. Yet the epic also reveals the tragic impossibility of humans returning to this paradise. Gilgamesh learns that immortality is reserved for the gods, and that humans must accept their mortality and find meaning within the limitations of earthly life. This tension between the desire for paradise and the acceptance of human limitations becomes a central theme in utopian thinking throughout history. Archaeological evidence from various ancient civilizations supports the idea that utopian thinking was widespread in the earliest human societies. Excavations of ancient settlements have revealed sophisticated artwork depicting ideal landscapes, perfect cities, and harmonious communities. For instance, the ancient Indus Valley civilization, which flourished around 2,500 years before Christ in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, shows evidence of remarkably well-planned cities with advanced drainage systems, equal-sized houses and public baths, suggesting they may have actually attempted to build utopian communities based on principles of equality and public health. The ancient Egyptians took their utopian visions so seriously that they spent enormous resources preparing for the afterlife paradise they believed awaited them. The elaborate burial practices, including mummification, tomb construction, and the inclusion of food, furniture, and servants in burial chambers, all reflect a practical belief that the utopian field of reeds was a real place that required real preparation. This shows us that for ancient peoples, utopian thinking was not merely escapist fantasy, but a driving force that shaped their actual behavior and social organization. Similarly, the ancient Chinese during the Zhou dynasty, which began around 1100 years before Christ, developed the concept of the mandate of heaven, which suggested that earthly rulers should create conditions as close as possible to divine perfection. Chinese texts from this period describe an ideal society where the emperor rules with perfect virtue, where social harmony prevails, where natural disasters do not occur, and where all people live in prosperity and peace. This political utopian thinking influenced Chinese governance for thousands of years and shows how ancient utopian ideas moved beyond religious or mythological contexts to become practical guides for organizing society. The persistence of utopian themes across all these ancient civilizations, despite their geographical separation and lack of contact with each other, suggests something profound about human nature. Whether in Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, or China, people consistently imagined perfect worlds characterized by abundance, peace, justice, and harmony. They dreamed of places without death, disease, conflict, or want. They envisioned societies where everyone was good, where social problems did not exist, and where humans lived in perfect relationship with nature and the divine. These early utopian visions established patterns that would echo throughout human history. They showed that utopian thinking serves important psychological and social functions, providing hope during difficult times, establishing moral ideals to strive toward, and creating shared visions that could unite communities around common goals. The ancient dreamers who sat around fires telling stories of better worlds were not just entertaining themselves, but were laying the foundation for humanity's ongoing quest to improve its condition and create more perfect societies. By 800 years before Christ, these scattered seeds of utopian thinking had taken root across the ancient world, setting the stage for the more systematic philosophical approaches that would emerge in ancient Greece. The dreams of Dilmun, the Field of Reeds, Satya Yuga, and Utnapishtim's Garden had shown that humans possessed a remarkable capacity to envision alternatives to their current circumstances and to use these visions as guides for moral and spiritual development. These ancient utopian dreams would continue to influence human thinking about perfect societies for thousands of years to come, proving that the desire for paradise is one of the most enduring and universal aspects of human nature. Chapter 2. Greek philosophers dream big, 800 to 300 BCE. Plato invents the blueprint. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble columns of ancient Athens as philosophers gathered in the shade of olive trees to debate the most important questions humans had ever asked. How should people live together? What makes a society good or bad? Can humans create a perfect world through reason and careful planning? These Greek thinkers, living in small city-states surrounded by the wine-dark Mediterranean Sea, would revolutionize how humanity thought about utopia by moving beyond ancient dreams and myths to create the first systematic blueprints for ideal societies. Unlike the Sumerians who imagined divine paradises or the Egyptians who placed perfection in the afterlife, the Greeks believed that smart humans could use logic, observation, and careful reasoning to design perfect communities right here on Earth. The story begins around 800 years before Christ with a blind poet named Homer, whose epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, became the foundation of all Western literature. Within these sweeping tales of heroes, gods, and great wars, Homer embedded a powerful vision of a lost golden age when the world was fundamentally different from his own time. According to Homer's poetry, there once existed a time when gods and humans lived together in harmony, when the earth produced food without human labor, when people never grew old or sick, and when war and conflict were unknown. This golden age, Homer explained, had gradually declined through successive ages of silver, bronze, and finally iron, each one worse than the last, until humans found themselves in their current state of struggle, violence, and mortality. Homer's golden age differed significantly from earlier utopian visions because it was presented not as a place humans could reach through death or divine favor, but as a historical period that had actually existed on Earth. The poet described how, during this perfect time, humans lived for hundreds of years while maintaining the strength and beauty of youth, how they spent their days in peaceful festivities and competitions, and how they enjoyed the constant company of gods who walked among them as friends and advisors. The earth itself was more generous during this golden age, producing grain, fruit, and honey without human cultivation, while rivers flowed with wine and milk instead of just water. Most importantly, Homer emphasized that this perfection was not maintained through magic or divine intervention, but through the natural goodness of humans who had not yet been corrupted by greed, ambition, or the other vices that plagued later generations. What made Homer's vision revolutionary was his suggestion that the decline from Golden Age to Iron Age was not inevitable or divinely decreed, but resulted from human choices and social arrangements. This implied that if humans could understand what went wrong, they might be able to create conditions that would restore some aspects of the Golden Age. This idea planted a crucial seed in Greek thinking that would later blossom into systematic attempts to design perfect societies through human reason and planning. The real breakthrough in Greek utopian thinking came several centuries later in the bustling city-state of Athens, where a young aristocrat named Plato would create the most influential vision of a perfect society in human history. Born around 427 years before Christ into a wealthy and politically connected family, Plato seemed destined for a career in politics and public service. However, his life took a dramatic turn when he became a student of Socrates, the wise and controversial philosopher who spent his days questioning Athenians about justice, virtue, and the proper way to live. Socrates taught Plato that most people lived their lives based on unexamined assumptions, and that true wisdom came only through rigorous questioning and logical analysis of fundamental concepts. When Socrates was executed by the Athenian democracy in 399 BCE, accused of corrupting the youth and undermining traditional religion, Plato became deeply disillusioned with Athenian politics and determined to discover what had gone wrong with his beloved city-state. He travelled extensively throughout the Mediterranean world, studying different forms of government and social organisation in places like Egypt, Sicily and southern Italy. Everywhere he went, Plato observed the same problems. Rulers who cared more about their own wealth and power than the welfare of their citizens, laws that favoured the rich over the poor, and social systems that seemed to bring out the worst rather than the best in human nature. Around 380 years before Christ, Plato founded the Academy in Athens, often considered the world's first university, where he spent the rest of his life teaching students and writing dialogues that explored fundamental philosophical questions. It was during this period that he composed his masterpiece, The Republic, a complex philosophical work presented as a conversation between Socrates and several other characters about the nature of justice and the ideal state. Unlike previous utopian visions that relied on divine intervention or mythical golden ages, Plato's Republic was a rational blueprint for a perfect society designed through careful analysis of human nature, social organization, and political structures. The Republic begins with a deceptively simple question: what is justice? As Socrates and his companions explore this question, they realize that justice in individuals cannot be understood without first understanding justice in society, since people are shaped by the communities in which they live. This leads them to embark on a thought experiment. If they could design a city-state from scratch, using only reason and the best available knowledge, what would it look like? The society they design becomes Plato's vision of the ideal state, a carefully structured community where every aspect of life is organized to promote justice, happiness, and human flourishing. At the heart of Plato's ideal state lies a revolutionary principle. Social roles should be determined not by birth, wealth, or family connections, but by individual talents and abilities. Plato argued that every person is born with natural aptitudes for certain types of work, and that a just society would identify these talents early and train each person for the role they are best suited to perform. He divided society into three main classes, each corresponding to different aspects of human nature and different functions within the community. The producers, including farmers, craftsmen, merchants and labourers, would provide the material goods and services necessary for society to function. The guardians, carefully selected for their physical strength, courage and loyalty, would serve as soldiers and police, protecting the community from external enemies and internal disorder. At the top of this hierarchy would be philosopher kings, individuals who combined the guardians' courage and loyalty with exceptional intellectual abilities and a deep understanding of truth, justice, and the good. This system of philosopher kings represented perhaps Plato's most radical departure from existing political arrangements. In the Athens of his time, political leadership often went to those who were best at public speaking, had the most money to spend on campaigns, or came from prominent families. Plato argued that this was like choosing ship captains based on their wealth, rather than their knowledge of navigation, or selecting doctors based on their popularity, rather than their medical expertise. Instead, he proposed that political power should go only to those who had spent years studying philosophy, mathematics, and the sciences, who understood the true nature of justice and virtue, and who had demonstrated that they cared more about the welfare of the community than their own personal interests. To ensure that philosopher kings would not be corrupted by power, Plato proposed that they should live under conditions of radical equality and communalism that would eliminate the usual temptations of political office. The guardian class, including both soldiers and philosopher kings, would own no private property, live in simple communal housing, eat together in common mess halls, and receive identical clothing and equipment from the community. They would have no access to gold, silver, or other luxury goods, and would be forbidden from engaging in trade or commerce. Most controversially, Plato suggested that guardians should not have traditional families, but should practice a form of communal marriage and child-rearing designed to eliminate conflicts between family loyalty and civic duty. Under Plato's system, sexual relationships among guardians would be carefully regulated by the philosopher kings to ensure that children would be produced by the best genetic combinations. The resulting offspring would be raised communally by specially trained nurses and teachers, never knowing who their biological parents were, so that all guardians would treat all children as their own. This arrangement, Plato argued, would eliminate the nepotism, inheritance disputes, and conflicted loyalties that plagued existing societies, while ensuring that future generations of guardians would be selected purely on merit rather than family connections. The education system in Plato's ideal state was designed with extraordinary care and detail, reflecting his belief that human nature was largely shaped by early experiences and cultural influences. Children would begin their education with carefully selected stories, songs, and games that would instill proper values and attitudes. Traditional Greek myths would be censored or rewritten to eliminate stories of gods behaving badly, since Plato believed that children should not be exposed to examples of divine injustice, deception, or immorality. Physical education would be equally important, developing strength, courage, and self-discipline through gymnastics, dancing, and military training. As students progressed through the educational system, they would be constantly tested and evaluated to determine their natural abilities and appropriate social roles. Those who showed aptitude only for practical skills would become producers, learning trades like carpentry, farming, or metalworking. Those who demonstrated physical courage and loyalty, but limited intellectual abilities, would become guardians, receiving extensive military training and instruction in the principles of justice and civic duty. Only a very few individuals who showed exceptional intellectual gifts and moral character would be selected for the lengthy process of philosophical education that would eventually qualify them to become philosopher kings. This philosophical education was extraordinarily demanding, requiring students to master mathematics, astronomy, music theory, and dialectical reasoning over the course of many years. Plato believed that mathematics was particularly important because it trained the mind to think about abstract concepts and eternal truths rather than the constantly changing world of physical appearances. Students would spend years studying geometry, arithmetic, and mathematical relationships, not because this knowledge was practically useful, but because it prepared their minds for the ultimate study of philosophy and the nature of absolute good. The economic system of Plato's ideal state was designed to promote cooperation and eliminate the conflicts that arose from competition for wealth and resources. Each class would focus on what it did best, with producers creating goods and services, guardians providing security and order, and philosopher kings managing the overall direction of society. There would be no money in the traditional sense, but rather a complex system of exchange that ensured everyone received what they needed for their role in society. Producers would be allowed to own property and accumulate wealth within reasonable limits, but guardians and philosopher kings would live in communal simplicity, the material needs provided by the community in exchange for their service. Trade with other city-states would be carefully regulated to prevent the corruption that Plato believed came from excessive wealth and luxury. The ideal state would strive to be as self-sufficient as possible, producing most of what it needed within its own borders and avoiding the complex commercial relationships that could lead to conflicts of interest or dependence on foreign powers. This economic isolationism was designed to preserve the moral purity and political independence that Plato saw as essential to maintaining a just society. Plato's vision extended beyond mere political and economic arrangements to encompass every aspect of cultural and intellectual life. Art, music, literature, and even architecture would all be subject to careful regulation to ensure they promoted virtue and social harmony rather than corrupting influences. Artists would not be free to create whatever they wished, but would work within guidelines established by the philosopher kings to produce works that educated citizens in proper values and beautiful ideals. Music would be particularly important since Plato believed that different musical modes and rhythms had direct effects on character and behavior. Only musical forms that promoted courage, self-discipline and justice would be permitted, while those that encouraged weakness, self-indulgence or antisocial behavior would be banned. The legal system in Plato's ideal state would be remarkably simple compared to the complex legal codes of contemporary societies. Since everyone would be educated from birth in proper behavior and social roles, and since the social structure would eliminate most sources of conflict and crime, there would be little need for elaborate laws and punishments. The philosopher kings would settle disputes and handle the few cases of misconduct that might arise, relying on their wisdom and understanding of justice rather than rigid legal procedures. This approach reflected Plato's belief that good laws were less important than good education and good social institutions in creating a just society. Religion in the ideal state would be carefully reformed to eliminate the anthropomorphic gods of traditional Greek mythology, who were often portrayed as quarrelling, deceiving, and behaving immorally. Instead, Plato proposed a rational theology based on the idea that the divine was perfectly good, unchanging, and truthful. Religious ceremonies and festivals would be designed to reinforce social unity and proper values, rather than to appease unpredictable deities or to provide entertainment for the masses. This religious reform was part of Plato's broader effort to create a coherent and rational worldview that would support the social and political institutions of the ideal state. Having constructed this elaborate vision of political perfection, Plato was well aware of the practical difficulties involved in actually creating such a society. In the later books of the Republic, he addresses the question of how an ideal state might come into existence, acknowledging that it would require either that existing rulers become philosophers or that philosophers somehow gain political power. He also recognizes that even if an ideal state were established, it would face the constant challenge of maintaining its perfection across generations, since the children of philosopher kings might not inherit their parents' wisdom and virtue. These concerns led Plato to create another famous utopian vision in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, where he tells the story of Atlantis, a powerful and technologically advanced civilization that had existed thousands of years in the past. According to Plato's account, Atlantis began as a perfect society with wise rulers, just laws, and great prosperity, but gradually became corrupted by wealth, luxury, and imperial ambition. The Atlanteans eventually became so arrogant and aggressive that the gods destroyed their entire civilization in a single day and night of earthquakes and floods, leaving no trace except the memory preserved in ancient Egyptian records. The story of Atlantis served as a warning about the fragility of even the most perfect societies and the constant danger of moral decay. Plato suggested that no human institution, however well designed, could maintain its perfection indefinitely without constant vigilance and renewal. This pessimistic recognition of human limitations would become a recurring theme in utopian thinking throughout history, raising difficult questions about whether perfect societies were ultimately achievable or merely useful ideals to strive toward. While Plato was developing his theoretical blueprints for the ideal state, many Greeks looked to the actual city-state of Sparta as the closest existing approximation to political perfection. Founded in the 8th century before Christ in the mountainous region of Laconia in southern Greece, Sparta had developed a unique social system that subordinated individual interests to collective welfare in ways that seemed to embody many utopian ideals. Unlike Athens, where citizens pursued private wealth and personal achievement, Spartan society was organized around the single goal of military excellence and state service. The Spartan system began with a radical form of selective breeding and child-rearing that eliminated the weak and nurtured only the strong. Newborn infants were examined by state officials, and those deemed physically defective were left to die on the mountainside. Healthy male children were taken from their families at age 7 and raised in communal barracks, where they underwent rigorous physical and military training designed to produce perfect soldiers. They learned to endure hardship, pain and deprivation without complaint, to value courage above life itself, and to see their individual identity as inseparable from the welfare of the Spartan state. Adult Spartan males lived under conditions of strict equality and communalism that resembled Plato's vision of the guardian class. They ate together in common mess halls, slept in military barracks, and owned no private property except for their basic weapons and equipment. The state provided land and slaves to support each citizen soldier, but this property could not be sold or accumulated, and luxury goods were strictly forbidden. Spartan currency was made of iron rather than gold or silver, deliberately designed to be too heavy and unwieldy for extensive trade or accumulation of wealth. The Spartan political system combined elements of monarchy, aristocracy and democracy in a complex arrangement that seemed to embody the principle of mixed government that many philosophers admired. 2 hereditary kings shared executive power. A council of elderly aristocrats provided wisdom and continuity, and an assembly of all citizens made important decisions about war and peace. This system had remained stable for centuries, avoiding the civil wars and political upheavals that plagued other Greek city-states. Most remarkably, Sparta had achieved a level of social discipline and collective purpose that seemed almost superhuman to other Greeks. Spartan soldiers were famous throughout the ancient world for their courage, skill, and willingness to die rather than retreat or surrender. The story of the 300 Spartans who died defending the pass at Thermopylae against a vastly superior Persian army became legendary, symbolizing the power of a society where individual citizens were willing to sacrifice everything for the common good. However, the Spartan system also revealed the potential dark side of utopian societies. The military perfection of Spartan citizens was built on the brutal exploitation of a much larger population of helots, state-owned serfs who worked the land, and provided the economic foundation that allowed citizens to devote themselves entirely to military training. The Helots lived in constant fear of their masters, who regularly organized secret police operations to hunt down and kill any Helots who showed signs of intelligence or leadership ability. This system of systematic oppression was considered necessary to maintain Spartan perfection, raising troubling questions about whether ideal societies inevitably required the exclusion or exploitation of some groups. The Spartan treatment of women also illustrated the complex relationship between utopian ideals and individual freedom. Spartan women enjoyed far more physical freedom and education than women in other Greek city-states, participating in athletic competitions, owning property, and expressing their opinions on public matters. However, this apparent liberation was entirely subordinated to the state's goal of producing strong soldiers. Women were valued primarily for their ability to bear and raise healthy male children, and their education and physical training were designed to serve this reproductive function rather than to develop their individual talents and interests. As the classical period of Greek civilization reached its peak in the 5th and 4th centuries before Christ, other philosophers began to develop their own variations on utopian themes. Aristophanes, the great comic playwright, wrote several satirical plays that imagined alternative social arrangements, including one where women took over the government and established a communist society, and another where birds created a perfect city in the sky between earth and heaven. While these comedies were intended primarily as entertainment and social criticism, rather than serious political proposals, they demonstrated the widespread Greek interest in imagining alternative ways of organizing society. The philosopher Aristotle, who had been Plato's student for 20 years, developed a more practical and less radical approach to political perfection in his work Politics. While he admired many aspects of his teacher's vision, Aristotle argued that Plato's ideal state was too extreme and impractical to be implemented in the real world. Instead of pursuing perfect justice through radical social engineering, Aristotle proposed that the best achievable society would be a constitutional government that balanced the interests of different social classes while maintaining respect for private property, family relationships, and individual freedom. Aristotle's more moderate approach reflected a growing recognition among Greek thinkers that human nature placed limits on how perfect any society could become. Unlike Plato, who believed that proper education and social institutions could eliminate most human vices and conflicts, Aristotle argued that people would always struggle with selfishness, ambition, and other imperfections that made utopian schemes unrealistic. He advocated for political systems that would work with human nature as it actually existed rather than trying to transform it completely. The conquest of Greece by Alexander the Great in the late 4th century before Christ marked the end of the independent city-state system that had nurtured Greek political experimentation and utopian thinking. As Greek culture spread throughout Alexander's vast empire, Greek philosophical ideas about ideal societies would influence civilizations from Egypt to India, but the practical laboratory of small autonomous city-states where different social arrangements could be tested and compared was lost forever. The legacy of Greek utopian thinking proved to be enormous and enduring. Plato's Republic became one of the most influential books in Western civilization, inspiring countless later attempts to design perfect societies and continuing to shape political philosophy more than 2,000 years after it was written. The specific features of Plato's ideal state including rule by philosopher kings, communal property for leaders, state-controlled education, and the subordination of individual interests to collective welfare, would reappear in various forms throughout history in movements ranging from early Christian monasticism to modern communist revolutions. Perhaps most importantly, the Greeks established the principle that human reason could be used to design better social institutions, and that political arrangements were not simply natural or divinely ordained, but could be consciously chosen and improved. This rational approach to social planning, combined with the Greek emphasis on systematic observation and logical analysis, created the intellectual foundation for all subsequent utopian thinking in Western civilization. The Greeks had shown that utopia was not just a matter of religious faith or poetic imagination, but could be approached as a practical problem in social engineering, requiring careful study of human nature, political institutions, and economic relationships. The Greek experiment in utopian thinking also revealed many of the fundamental tensions and contradictions that would continue to plague attempts at creating perfect societies throughout history. The conflict between individual freedom and collective welfare, the difficulty of maintaining moral purity in the face of power and wealth, the challenge of educating people to be virtuous citizens, and the question of whether utopian ideals were achievable goals or merely useful standards for criticism and reform, all emerged clearly in Greek political philosophy and would continue to challenge utopian thinkers for centuries to come. Chapter 3. Early Christians build heaven on earth, 500 CE. In the 1st century of the Common Era, a Jewish preacher named Jesus of Nazareth began traveling through the Roman province of Palestine, delivering a message that would fundamentally transform how humans thought about perfect societies. According to the Christian Gospels written decades after his death, Jesus proclaimed the coming of what he called the Kingdom of Heaven, a concept that merged earthly social transformation with spiritual salvation in ways that previous utopian thinkers had never imagined. The Gospel accounts describe Jesus' teaching that this perfect kingdom was not merely a distant afterlife destination, but something that could begin manifesting in the present world through the actions and communities of his followers. This revolutionary idea that paradise could be partially realized on earth while also being promised in the afterlife created an entirely new category of utopian thinking that would influence Western civilization for the next 2 millennia. The earliest Christian communities, established in Jerusalem around 30 CE, immediately after Jesus' death, attempted to put these utopian teachings into practice in ways that were remarkably radical for their time. The Acts of the Apostles, written by the evangelist Luke sometime between 80 and 90 CE, provides detailed descriptions of these experimental communities that historians consider among the first documented attempts at creating voluntary communist societies in human history. According to Luke's account, the early Christians in Jerusalem held all property in common, with members selling their individual possessions and placing the proceeds in a common fund administered by the apostles. No one claimed private ownership of anything, and goods were distributed to each person according to their need rather than their ability to pay or their social status. Archaeological evidence from 1st century Jerusalem supports the existence of these communal Christian groups, though the historical details are sometimes difficult to separate from the theological interpretations presented in the New Testament texts. Excavations in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem have revealed large houses from this period that appear to have been modified to accommodate extended groups of people living together, with communal dining areas, shared storage spaces and sleeping arrangements that suggest collective rather than nuclear family organization. These physical remains indicate that the early Christian experiment in communal living was not merely a spiritual metaphor, but involved actual restructuring of domestic and economic life in pursuit of their utopian ideals. The Christian approach to utopian community differed significantly from earlier Greek philosophical models or contemporary Jewish sectarian experiments like those of the Essenes at Qumran. While other groups often emphasized withdrawal from society or the rule of philosophical elites, the early Christians maintained that their perfect communities should be open to all people regardless of social background, education, or previous religious affiliation. The Apostle Paul, writing to various Christian communities throughout the Roman Empire between 50 and 65 CE, repeatedly emphasized that in these new societies there should be no distinction between Jew and Greek, slave and free, male and female, since all were considered equal members of the body of Christ. This radical egalitarianism created practical challenges that the early Christian communities struggled to resolve. The letters of Paul reveal ongoing tensions within these experimental societies over questions of authority, resource distribution, and social organization. In his first letter to the Corinthians, written around 55 CE, Paul addresses conflicts that had arisen during communal meals, where wealthier members were apparently eating better food than poorer members, contradicting the community's stated commitment to equality. His proposed solutions involved detailed regulations for communal dining that would ensure equal treatment for all participants, showing how seriously these early Christians took their utopian goals and how willing they were to modify their practices when those goals were not being met. The success and expansion of these early Christian communities attracted the attention of Roman authorities, who viewed them with suspicion, partly because their communal practices and egalitarian ideals challenged the hierarchical structure of Roman society. The Roman historian Pliny the Younger, writing to Emperor Trajan around 112 CE, describes Christian communities as secretive groups that held regular meetings where they shared food equally and made decisions collectively, practices that Romans associated with potentially seditious political organizations. This external pressure actually strengthened the utopian character of early Christian communities by forcing them to develop stronger internal bonds and more sophisticated methods of mutual support. As Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire during the 2nd and 3rd centuries, different communities experimented with various approaches to creating perfect societies. Some groups, like the Montanists in Asia Minor, emphasized prophetic experiences and the imminent arrival of the heavenly kingdom on earth, organizing their communities around charismatic leaders who claimed direct divine inspiration. Others, like the communities described in the Didache, a Christian manual dating from the late 1st or early 2nd century, focused on practical ethical guidelines for communal living, including detailed instructions for sharing resources, resolving conflicts, and maintaining spiritual discipline. The most influential and long-lasting Christian utopian experiment began in the Egyptian desert around 270 CE, when a young man named Anthony, later known as Saint Anthony the Great, decided to take Jesus' teachings about poverty and spiritual perfection to their logical extreme. According to the life of Anthony, written by Bishop Athanasius, around 360 CE, Anthony sold all his possessions, gave the money to the poor, and withdrew to the desert to live as a hermit in pursuit of spiritual perfection. What started as an individual quest for holiness gradually evolved into a new form of Christian community as other seekers joined Anthony in the desert, creating the first Christian monastic communities. These early monastic communities represented a synthesis of Greek philosophical ideals about the perfect life with Christian theological concepts about salvation and community. The Desert Fathers and Mothers, as they came to be known, developed detailed rules for communal living that addressed every aspect of daily life from work and prayer schedules to conflict resolution and economic organization. Their communities were typically small, rarely exceeding 50 or 60 members, and were organized around principles of voluntary poverty, celibacy, obedience to communal decisions, and dedication to prayer and manual labor. The monastic approach to Christian utopia proved remarkably successful and durable, spreading from Egypt throughout the eastern Mediterranean and eventually to Western Europe. By 400 CE, there were thousands of monastic communities scattered across the Christian world, each attempting to create a perfect society in miniature. The success of these communities stemmed partly from their realistic approach to human nature and their acknowledgement that creating perfect societies required ongoing effort and institutional support rather than simply good intentions. The most sophisticated theological framework for Christian utopian thinking emerged in the early 5th century through the writings of Augustine of Hippo, whose massive work, The City of God, provided a comprehensive vision of how perfect society related to both earthly political communities and heavenly spiritual realities. Augustine began writing this work in 413 CE in response to the sack of Rome by Visigothic forces, which had prompted many Romans to blame Christianity for weakening the empire. His response involved developing a complex theory about two cities that exist simultaneously in the world: the earthly city built on human pride and selfish love, and the city of God built on divine love and perfect justice. Augustine's vision was both more realistic and more ambitious than earlier Christian utopian thinking. He acknowledged that no earthly society could achieve perfect justice or eliminate all conflict and suffering, but he maintained that Christian communities could serve as partial anticipations of the heavenly city by embodying divine love in their social relationships. This perspective allowed Christians to work for social improvement and community building while avoiding the disappointment that often accompanies failed utopian experiments. Augustine's framework also provided theological justification for ongoing efforts to create better societies without requiring those societies to be perfect. The practical impact of Augustine's thinking can be seen in the numerous Christian communities that were established throughout the later Roman Empire using his theological principles. These communities typically combined elements of monastic organization with engagement in broader social and economic activities. They maintained communal property and decision-making structures while also providing services like education, healthcare, and care for the poor to surrounding populations. This model proved particularly effective during the social upheavals that accompanied the collapse of Roman authority in Western Europe during the 5th and 6th centuries. The Christian approach to utopian community also influenced broader social and political developments in the late Roman Empire. Christian emperors like Constantine and Theodosius attempted to implement Christian social principles in imperial legislation, creating laws that protected slaves, provided for the poor, and promoted what they considered Christian virtues. While these efforts fell far short of creating perfect societies, they represent some of the first attempts by political authorities to use utopian ideals as guides for practical governance. The rise of Christianity also transformed how people thought about the relationship between individual salvation and social transformation. Earlier utopian thinking had generally assumed that perfect societies would be populated by naturally virtuous people. But Christian theology introduced the idea that flawed human beings could be transformed through divine grace into citizens of perfect communities. This theological innovation made utopian thinking more psychologically realistic, while also making it more demanding, since it required not just external social changes, but internal spiritual transformation. The gender dynamics of early Christian communities also represented a significant departure from earlier utopian models. While Greek philosophical communities like Plato's Republic had included some provisions for gender equality, most ancient utopian thinking assumed male leadership and female subordination. Early Christian communities, by contrast, often included women in leadership roles and decision-making processes, though this egalitarian tendency was gradually reduced as Christianity became more institutionalized. Archaeological evidence from early Christian burial sites shows that women were often buried with the same honors as men and were commemorated as community leaders and benefactors. The economic innovations of early Christian communities also influenced later utopian experiments. Their combination of voluntary poverty with productive labor created sustainable economic models that supported community members while also generating surplus resources for charitable activities. The monastic communities in particular developed sophisticated approaches to agriculture, manufacturing and trade that allowed them to maintain economic independence while adhering to their communal principles. These economic practices were later adopted by various medieval communities and influenced the development of cooperative economic theories in modern times. By 500 CE, Christian utopian thinking had established several key principles that would influence Western social development for centuries to come. These included the idea that perfect societies should be based on voluntary participation rather than coercion, that economic resources should be shared according to need rather than merit or social status, that leadership should be based on service rather than domination, and that social transformation should be accompanied by personal spiritual development. While no Christian community fully achieved these ideals, the ongoing effort to implement them created a culture of social experimentation and reform that became characteristic of Western civilization. The influence of early Christian utopian experiments extended far beyond the Christian communities themselves. Jewish communities throughout the Roman Empire adopted some Christian communal practices, particularly in areas where Christians and Jews lived in close proximity. Similarly, various philosophical schools modified their approaches to community organization in response to the practical success of Christian groups. Even Roman imperial administrators sometimes adopted Christian social policies when they proved effective at maintaining order and promoting economic development. The literary and artistic production of early Christian communities also reflected their utopian aspirations and provided models for later generations. Works like The Shepherd of Hermas, written in Rome around 140 CE, presented detailed visions of perfect Christian communities organized around principles of mutual love and divine guidance. The proliferation of Christian hymns, prayers, and liturgical texts created a shared cultural vocabulary for expressing utopian hopes and commitments. This cultural production helped sustain Christian utopian movements even when particular communities failed or were persecuted. The persecution of Christians by Roman authorities during the 3rd and early 4th centuries actually strengthened the utopian character of Christian communities by creating a sense of shared struggle and common destiny. The accounts of Christian martyrs often emphasize their commitment to communal values and their willingness to die rather than abandon their experimental societies. These martyrdom narratives became foundational texts for later Christian utopian movements and provided inspiration for communities facing their own challenges and setbacks. The transformation of Christianity from a persecuted minority religion to the official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine in the early 4th century created new opportunities and challenges for Christian utopian thinking. On one hand, official recognition allowed Christian communities to expand their social experiments and implement their ideals on a larger scale. On the other hand, the association with political power threatened to compromise the voluntary and egalitarian principles that had characterized earlier Christian communities. This tension between utopian ideals and political reality became a permanent feature of Christian social thinking and influenced the development of various reform movements throughout subsequent centuries. Chapter 4. Islamic Golden Dreams, 622–1400 CE. The emergence of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula during the early 7th century brought forth a new and distinctive approach to creating perfect societies that combined practical political organization with detailed spiritual visions of paradise in ways that differed significantly from earlier Christian and classical models. The Islamic understanding of utopia was fundamentally shaped by the Quran, which Muslims believe contains the direct revelations of God to the Prophet Muhammad, and by the historical example of the community that Muhammad established in the city of Medina beginning in 622 CE. This early Islamic community, known as the Ummah, represented both a practical experiment in creating a just society and a model for future Muslim communities seeking to implement divine guidance in their social and political organization. The Constitution of Medina, established by Muhammad shortly after his arrival in the city in 622 CE, represents one of the most remarkable documents in the history of utopian political thinking. This charter, preserved in various early Islamic historical sources, established a multi-religious political community that included not only Muhammad's Muslim followers, but also the various Arab tribes of Medina and the city's substantial Jewish population. The Constitution recognized all these groups as part of a single community with shared rights and responsibilities, while allowing each group to maintain its own religious practices and internal legal systems. This pluralistic approach to perfect society was unprecedented in the ancient world and represented a significant innovation in utopian thinking. The practical success of the Medinan community under Muhammad's leadership provided a concrete example of how divine guidance could be implemented in actual political and social organization. According to early Islamic historical sources, the community achieved remarkable internal peace and external security, despite being surrounded by hostile forces and facing severe economic challenges. The sources describe a society where social conflicts were resolved through consultation and divine guidance, where economic resources were distributed according to need and merit, and where different religious and tribal groups coexisted peacefully under a shared system of law and governance. The rapid expansion of Islamic political control throughout the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Europe and Asia during the 7th and 8th centuries created opportunities for Muslim thinkers and administrators to experiment with implementing Islamic social ideals on an unprecedented scale. The early Islamic conquests were not merely military campaigns, but also social experiments in creating just and prosperous societies based on Islamic principles. The historical sources describe how Muslim administrators often improved the conditions of conquered populations by implementing more equitable taxation systems, providing better legal protections for minorities, and creating more efficient systems of public administration. The concept of the caliphate, which emerged as the standard form of Islamic political organization after Muhammad's death in 632 CE, represented an attempt to institutionalize the perfect society that had been achieved in Medina. The caliph was understood to be the successor to Muhammad in his role as political leader of the Muslim community, though not in his role as prophet. The ideal caliph was expected to govern according to Islamic law and to maintain the just and prosperous society that Muhammad had established. While the reality of caliphal rule often fell short of these ideals, the concept provided a framework for Islamic political thinking that emphasized the possibility of creating perfect societies through proper leadership and adherence to divine guidance. The development of Islamic law, known as Sharia, during the 8th and 9th centuries, represented a systematic attempt to codify the social and legal principles that would govern the perfect Islamic society. Islamic legal scholars, known as jurists, developed detailed regulations covering every aspect of social life, from commercial transactions and family relationships to criminal punishment and international relations. These legal codes were based on the Quran, the recorded sayings and actions of Muhammad, and the reasoning and consensus of qualified scholars. The resulting legal system was intended to create a comprehensive framework for just society that could be implemented in any time and place. The translation movement that flourished in Baghdad and other Islamic centers during the 8th and 9th centuries brought Greek philosophical works into Arabic and led to a sophisticated synthesis of Islamic theology with classical political philosophy. Muslim philosophers like al-Kindi, al-Farabi, and Ibn Sina developed elaborate theories about the perfect state that combined Platonic and Aristotelian political thinking with Islamic theological concepts. Al-Farabi's The Perfect State, written in the 10th century, presented a detailed vision of an ideal society governed by a philosopher king who possessed both intellectual excellence and spiritual insight, ruling over citizens who were organized according to their natural abilities and moral development. The practical implementation of these philosophical ideals can be seen in the various Islamic societies that flourished during the classical period of Islamic civilization. The Abbasid Caliphate, which ruled from Baghdad from 750 to 1258 CE, created what many historians consider one of the most successful multicultural societies in human history. The Caliphate included peoples of various ethnicities, languages, and religious backgrounds who were integrated into a single political and cultural system while maintaining their distinct identities. The capital city of Baghdad became a center of learning, commerce, and cultural exchange that attracted scholars, merchants, and artisans from across the known world. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established during the early 9th century under Caliph al-Ma'mun, represented perhaps the most successful attempt to create a utopian community of scholars and intellectuals in the medieval world. This institution brought together Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and Zoroastrian scholars to collaborate in translating, preserving, and advancing human knowledge in fields ranging from mathematics and astronomy to medicine and philosophy. The House of Wisdom operated according to principles of intellectual freedom and scholarly cooperation that transcended religious and cultural boundaries, creating a model of how diverse communities could work together in pursuit of truth and human betterment. The success of the House of Wisdom and similar institutions throughout the Islamic world demonstrated the practical viability of Islamic approaches to creating perfect societies. These institutions were supported by wealthy patrons and government officials who believed that the pursuit of knowledge was both a religious duty and a means of creating better societies. The scholars who worked in these institutions developed new methods of scientific investigation, made significant advances in mathematics and astronomy, and preserved and transmitted the intellectual heritage of ancient civilizations. Their work created the foundation for later scientific and philosophical developments in both the Islamic world and medieval Europe. The Islamic conquest of the Iberian Peninsula in 711 CE led to the creation of Al-Andalus, which became one of the most remarkable examples of Islamic utopian society in practice. For several centuries, Al-Andalus maintained a level of religious tolerance, cultural sophistication, and economic prosperity that was unmatched elsewhere in medieval Europe. The society included significant populations of Muslims, Christians, and Jews who lived together in relative harmony, while contributing to a flourishing culture that produced advances in science, philosophy, literature, and the arts. The cities of Córdoba, Seville, and Granada became centers of learning and culture that attracted visitors from throughout Europe and the Mediterranean world. The success of Al-Andalus as a multicultural society was based on several key Islamic principles that promoted social harmony and cultural development. The Islamic concept of dhimma provided legal protection for Christian and Jewish communities while allowing them to maintain their own religious practices and internal governance. The Islamic emphasis on education and scholarship created institutions that welcomed students and teachers from all backgrounds. The Islamic legal system provided mechanisms for resolving conflicts between different communities while maintaining overall social order. These principles created a framework for the kind of diverse, tolerant and prosperous society that many utopian thinkers had imagined, but few had successfully implemented. The economic innovations of medieval Islamic societies also contributed to their success in creating prosperous and equitable communities. Islamic commercial law developed sophisticated mechanisms for trade, banking, and investment that facilitated economic growth while maintaining ethical standards. The Islamic institution of Wasuf, or religious endowment, created a system for funding public services like education, healthcare, and infrastructure that operated independently of government taxation. The Islamic principles of social justice, including the obligation to pay zakat or charitable contributions, created mechanisms for redistributing wealth and supporting the poor that were more systematic and effective than those found in most other medieval societies. The development of Sufism during the 9th and 10th centuries added a mystical dimension to Islamic utopian thinking that emphasized the possibility of achieving spiritual perfection through direct experience of the divine. Sufi orders created communities of spiritual seekers who lived according to strict disciplines designed to purify the soul and achieve union with God. These communities often served as models of perfect society in miniature, organized around principles of spiritual equality, mutual support, and devotion to higher purposes. The poetry, music, and literature produced by Sufi communities expressed utopian visions of spiritual transformation and divine love that influenced Islamic culture for centuries. The Fatimid Caliphate, which ruled Egypt and much of North Africa from 909 to 1171 CE, represented an attempt to create a perfect Islamic society based on Shia theological principles. The Fatimids claimed to be descendants of the Prophet Muhammad through his daughter Fatima, and believed that their rule represented the fulfillment of divine promises about the coming of a just ruler who would establish perfect society on earth. Under Fatimid rule, Egypt became a centre of learning and culture that rivaled Baghdad, with institutions like Al-Azhar University that attracted scholars from throughout the Islamic world. The Fatimids also implemented social policies that promoted religious tolerance and economic development, creating a prosperous and stable society that lasted for over 2 centuries. The Crusades, which began in 1095 CE and continued intermittently for several centuries, brought Islamic and Christian utopian ideals into direct contact and conflict. The Islamic response to the Crusades was shaped by the concept of jihad, which included not only military struggle, but also the broader effort to create and defend just Islamic societies. Leaders like Saladin, who recaptured Jerusalem from the Crusaders in 1187 CE, were celebrated not only for their military victories, but also for their efforts to implement Islamic principles of justice and mercy in their treatment of conquered populations. The Islamic chronicles of the Crusades often contrast the idealized Islamic society with what they portray as the greed and violence of the crusading states. The development of Islamic philosophy during the medieval period produced sophisticated theories about the relationship between perfect society and individual human development. Philosophers like Ibn Rushd, Averroes, and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, argued that the perfect state existed to promote human flourishing and intellectual development, combining Aristotelian concepts of political community with Islamic theological principles. Their works were translated into Latin and influenced medieval European political thinking, creating a cross-cultural dialogue about the nature of perfect society that continued for centuries. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century destroyed many of the great Islamic centers of learning and culture, including Baghdad in 1258 CE, but also led to new experiments in creating multicultural Islamic societies. The Mongol rulers of the Islamic world often converted to Islam and attempted to create synthesis societies that combined Mongol administrative practices with Islamic legal and cultural traditions. The Ilkhanate in Persia and the Golden Horde in Central Asia represented attempts to create new forms of Islamic utopian society that incorporated the nomadic traditions of the Mongols with the urban civilization of the Islamic world. The later medieval period saw the emergence of new Islamic movements that emphasized the possibility of restoring the perfect society of the early Islamic community through spiritual and social reform. These movements often criticized the existing Islamic societies for departing from the original ideals of Islam and called for return to the pure practices of the Prophet Muhammad and his companions. While these reform movements sometimes led to political instability and conflict, they also renewed Islamic commitment to creating just and perfect societies and provided inspiration for later Islamic reform and renewal movements. By 1400 CE, Islamic civilization had created numerous examples of successful, multicultural, prosperous, and relatively just societies that served as models for utopian thinking throughout the medieval world. The Islamic synthesis of religious idealism with practical political organization, the Islamic commitment to learning and cultural development, and the Islamic principles of social justice and religious tolerance had created a distinctive approach to perfect society that influenced subsequent utopian movements in both the Islamic world and beyond. The decline of some of these societies due to external invasions and internal conflicts did not diminish their historical significance as examples of how utopian ideals could be successfully implemented in actual political and social organization. Chapter 5. Medieval Visions and Earthly Experiments, 500–1400 CE. The collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century left Europe fragmented into countless small kingdoms, plagued by constant warfare, disease, and economic instability. Yet paradoxically, this period of apparent chaos and decline became one of the most creative eras in the history of utopian experimentation. Unlike the ancient world, where perfect societies were mostly imagined as distant places or future times, medieval Europeans actually tried to build small-scale utopian communities right in their own troubled world. These experiments were almost entirely religious in nature, driven by the Christian belief that it was possible to create glimpses of heaven on earth through careful organization of human communities according to divine principles. The foundation of medieval utopian thinking was laid in 529 CE when Benedict of Nursia wrote what became known as the Rule of Saint Benedict. Benedict was born into a wealthy Roman family around 480 CE, but he became disgusted with the moral corruption he saw in Roman society and retreated to live as a hermit in a cave near Subiaco, Italy. After years of solitary prayer and meditation, Benedict concluded that the best way to serve God was not through individual hermitage, but through carefully organized communities of monks living together in perfect harmony. His rule, which consists of 73 short chapters, provided incredibly detailed instructions for creating what he believed would be ideal Christian communities. Benedict's rule addressed every aspect of daily life in the monastery, from how many hours monks should spend in prayer, work and study, to what they should eat, wear and own. The rule established that monks should possess absolutely nothing of their own, sharing all property in common under the guidance of an abbot who served as both spiritual father and practical administrator. Each day was carefully divided into 8 periods of communal prayer called the Divine Office, balanced with manual labour, scholarly study, and meals eaten together in complete silence while one monk read aloud from religious texts. Benedict believed that this precise balance of prayer, work and learning would eliminate the 3 main sources of human unhappiness: pride, greed and idleness. What made Benedict's approach revolutionary was his understanding that creating a perfect community required not just good intentions, but careful attention to practical details. The rule specified exactly how much food each monk should receive, what clothes they should wear in different seasons, how guests should be welcomed, how sick monks should be cared for, and how disputes should be resolved. Benedict had observed that previous attempts at monastic life often failed because they relied too heavily on individual virtue without providing sufficient structure and guidance. His rule created a comprehensive system that could function regardless of the personal weaknesses or strengths of individual monks. The success of Benedictine monasticism was extraordinary. Within 2 centuries of Benedict's death in 547 CE, Benedictine monasteries had spread across Europe, becoming centres not only of religious life but also of learning, agriculture and technological innovation. These monasteries preserved ancient Greek and Roman texts during the chaotic early medieval period, developed new farming techniques that increased agricultural productivity, and created some of the most beautiful architecture and art of the medieval world. The monastery at Monte Cassino, which Benedict founded, became a model copied throughout Europe, proving that his vision of perfect Christian community was not just theoretically appealing, but practically achievable. The most spectacular example of Benedictine success was Cluny Abbey, founded in Burgundy, France, in 910 CE by William I, Duke of Aquitaine. Cluny was established with an unusual charter that freed it from control by local nobles or bishops, allowing it to develop according to pure Benedictine principles without outside interference. Under the leadership of a series of remarkable abbots, particularly St. Odo, St. Hugh, and Peter the Venerable, Cluny became the centre of a vast network of reformed monasteries that stretched across Europe. At its peak in the 12th century, Cluny directly controlled over 1,000 monasteries and influenced countless others. The physical scale of Cluny Abbey reflected its spiritual ambitions. The monastery church, completed in the early 12th century, was the largest building in the Christian world until the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome 4 centuries later. The abbey complex housed over 1,000 monks, making it larger than most medieval cities. The daily routine at Cluny was even more elaborate than what Benedict had originally prescribed, with the monks spending up to 8 hours each day in communal prayer and liturgical ceremonies of breathtaking beauty and complexity. Visitors from across Europe came to witness these services, which were considered the closest thing to heavenly worship available on earth. The Cluniacs believed they were creating a perfect society based on the principle that human life should be devoted entirely to glorifying God through prayer, study, and beautiful worship. Unlike later monastic reforms that emphasized manual labor, the Cluniacs saw their primary work as spiritual, leaving physical labor to servants and lay brothers, while the choir monks concentrated on the elaborate performance of the divine office. This approach created communities of extraordinary intellectual and artistic achievement, producing illuminated manuscripts, theological works, and architectural innovations that influenced European culture for centuries. However, the very success of Cluny and other Benedictine monasteries eventually led to criticism that they had become too wealthy, comfortable, and removed from the simple poverty that Jesus had taught. In response to these concerns, a new wave of monastic reform began in 1098 CE when Robert of Molyneux founded a new monastery at Citeaux in Burgundy. Robert and his followers, who became known as Cistercians, sought to return to what they believed was the original purity of Benedict's rule, stripped of the elaborate ceremonial and material prosperity that characterized Cluny. The Cistercian reform movement was led by Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential religious figures of the 12th century. Bernard argued that true Christian perfection required absolute poverty, simplicity, and separation from worldly concerns. Cistercian monasteries were built in remote valleys and forests, far from cities and towns, where monks could support themselves entirely through their own agricultural labour. The Cistercians rejected elaborate church decoration, colourful vestments and complex liturgical ceremonies, preferring plain stone buildings, simple woolen habits, and streamlined worship services that left more time for manual work and private prayer. The Cistercian vision of utopian community was based on the belief that paradise could be regained through return to the simple agricultural life that God had originally intended for humanity before the fall. Cistercian monks became skilled farmers, engineers and craftsmen, developing innovative techniques for draining swamps, breeding livestock and managing forests. Their monasteries became models of economic self-sufficiency and environmental stewardship, proving that religious communities could achieve both spiritual perfection and material prosperity through intelligent application of Christian principles to practical problems. The success of the Cistercian model was remarkable. Within 50 years of the foundation of Citeaux, there were over 300 Cistercian monasteries across Europe, each one a small utopian community of 50 to 100 monks living according to identical rules and practices. The Cistercians developed a sophisticated administrative system that allowed them to maintain uniformity across this vast network while adapting to local conditions. Annual general chapters brought abbots together to share innovations and resolve problems, creating what was perhaps the first international organization in European history. While monks experimented with perfect religious communities, a different kind of utopian thinking emerged among the military religious orders that developed during the Crusades. The Knights Templar, founded around 1119 CE by Hugh de Pins and 8 other French knights, attempted to create a new form of Christian perfection that combined monastic vows with military service. The Templars took traditional monastic vows of poverty, chastity and obedience, but instead of withdrawing from the world to pray and work, they dedicated themselves to protecting Christian pilgrims and fighting in the Holy Land. The Templar Rule, written by Bernard of Clairvaux, created what was essentially a monastic community organized for warfare. Templar knights lived in commanderies that functioned like monasteries, with communal meals, regular prayer services, and strict discipline. But they also maintained horses, weapons, and military equipment for their campaigns in the East. The Templars believed they were creating a new model of Christian life that proved it was possible to serve God through fighting as well as through prayer, challenging the traditional medieval assumption that spiritual perfection required withdrawal from worldly concerns. The Templar experiment in combining contemplative and active life influenced other military orders, including the Knights Hospitaller and the Teutonic Knights, each of which developed its own vision of perfect Christian warrior community. These orders established networks of commanderies across Europe that served as recruiting centres, financial institutions, and staging areas for crusading activities. The Templars in particular became enormously wealthy and powerful, developing innovative banking techniques and establishing what amounted to an international financial network that connected Europe with the Middle East. The success of these military orders demonstrated that medieval utopian thinking was not limited to peaceful withdrawal from the world, but could also inspire active engagement with worldly problems. The Templars and their sister orders believed they were creating a new form of Christian society that would eventually transform all of Europe into a perfect kingdom of God on earth, united in the struggle against non-Christian forces, and organized according to principles of religious discipline and military efficiency. Medieval utopian thinking reached its most visionary expression in the prophecies of Joachim of Fiore, a Calabrian abbot who lived from approximately 1135 to 1202 CE. Joachim developed a revolutionary interpretation of Christian history that divided all of time into 3 ages, corresponding to the 3 persons of the Trinity. The first age, the age of the Father, lasted from Adam to Christ and was characterized by law, fear, and Old Testament revelation. The second age, the age of the Son, began with Christ's incarnation and was characterized by grace, faith, and New Testament revelation. But Joachim prophesied that a third age was coming, the age of the Holy Spirit, which would be characterized by love, understanding, and direct spiritual illumination that would make written scriptures unnecessary. Joachim predicted that the age of the Spirit would begin around 1260 CE and would witness the establishment of perfect Christian communities across the earth. In this coming age, all humans would become contemplatives, living in monastic-style communities, but without need for elaborate rules or external authority, because everyone would be guided directly by the Holy Spirit. There would be no more war, no more poverty, no more ignorance, and no more institutional church, because all people would have direct access to divine truth. Joachim's vision was essentially a monasticized version of the entire world, where the perfection that monks achieved in their small communities would extend to all of humanity. The influence of Joachimite prophecy on medieval utopian thinking was enormous. Joachim's ideas inspired numerous reform movements, including radical branches of the Franciscan order, who believed that St. Francis had inaugurated the beginning of the Age of the Spirit. These spiritual Franciscans attempted to create communities of absolute poverty and simplicity that they believed represented the perfect society of the coming age. Joachimite ideas also influenced secular political movements, including the attempts by Holy Roman Emperors Frederick II and later Frederick Barbarossa to create universal Christian empires that would prepare the way for the prophesied spiritual age. The medieval period also witnessed numerous attempts by lay Christians to create perfect communities outside traditional monastic structures. The Beguines, a movement of religious women that emerged in the Low Countries during the 12th century, established semi-monastic communities where women could pursue religious perfection while remaining technically in the secular world. Beguine communities, called beguinages, were essentially small utopian towns where women lived in individual houses but shared communal facilities for worship, work, and mutual support. The Beguines supported themselves through textile production, care of the sick, and education of children, proving that religious utopian communities could function without complete withdrawal from secular society. Similarly, the Waldensians, followers of Peter Waldo, who began preaching voluntary poverty in Lyon around 1170, attempted to create communities based on literal imitation of apostolic life, as described in the New Testament. The Waldensians rejected private property, refused to take oaths, and practiced complete pacifism, believing that these principles would allow them to recreate the perfect Christian community of the early Church. Although persecuted by church authorities, Waldensian communities survived in remote alpine valleys, maintaining their utopian vision of apostolic perfection for centuries. The medieval guilds that organized urban craftsmen and merchants also embodied utopian elements, creating what were essentially perfect communities of skilled workers united by common craft traditions, religious devotions, and mutual support systems. Guild regulations specified not only technical standards for craft production but also moral requirements for guild members, including attendance at religious services, participation in charitable activities, and maintenance of family respectability. The guilds created elaborate ceremonial life centered on patron saints, mystery plays, and communal feasts that reinforced their identity as spiritual as well as economic communities. Medieval cathedral building projects represented another form of utopian thinking, as entire communities united around the goal of creating perfect architectural expressions of Christian faith. The construction of great cathedrals like Chartres Canterbury and Cologne required generations of sustained communal effort, with entire towns organizing their economic and social life around these massive projects. Medieval people believed that participating in cathedral construction was a form of religious devotion that would help create heaven on earth by building structures worthy of divine worship. The medieval Islamic world also produced important utopian experiments during this period, particularly in the form of Sufi brotherhoods that created communities dedicated to mystical perfection. Sufi masters like Abu Hamid al-Ghazali and Ibn Arabi developed sophisticated theories about how human communities could be organized to facilitate spiritual development and direct experience of divine reality. Sufi lodges called khanqahs or tekkes functioned as utopian communities where disciples lived under the guidance of enlightened masters, following elaborate spiritual disciplines designed to purify the soul and achieve unity with God. The success of medieval monastic communities in particular had a profound influence on later utopian thinking. The monasteries proved that it was actually possible to create small-scale societies based on principles of equality, cooperation, and shared purpose that functioned effectively for centuries. The monastic emphasis on balancing prayer, work and study provided a model for organizing human activity that influenced educational institutions, agricultural communities, and even early industrial enterprises. The monastic tradition of detailed written rules and careful attention to practical organization showed future utopian planners the importance of systematic thinking about community structure and governance. Medieval utopian experiments also revealed important limitations that would challenge later reformers. The success of monastic communities depended heavily on voluntary participation by individuals who were genuinely committed to religious goals and willing to subordinate personal desires to communal needs. Attempts to extend monastic principles to larger populations or to people without strong religious motivation generally failed. The medieval experiments also showed that utopian communities could become victims of their own success, as wealth and influence tended to corrupt the simplicity and equality that had originally made them attractive. By 1400 CE, medieval Europe had produced hundreds of successful utopian experiments, from tiny hermitages housing a few monks to vast monastic networks controlling thousands of communities across the continent. These experiments had proven that human beings were capable of creating and maintaining perfect societies on a small scale, given appropriate motivation, organization, and leadership. The medieval legacy provided a foundation of practical experience and theoretical reflection that would influence all subsequent utopian thinking, demonstrating both the possibilities and limitations of human efforts to create paradise on earth. The medieval period established the crucial principle that utopian thinking needed to move beyond mere speculation to actual experimentation with real communities of real people facing real problems. The monks, knights, and other medieval visionaries showed that perfect societies were not just pleasant fantasies, but achievable goals that required careful planning, dedicated effort, and willingness to learn from both successes and failures. Their legacy would inspire the Renaissance humanists who would take utopian thinking in new directions while building on the solid foundation of medieval practical experience with intentional communities.